I've also heard a lot of people raise arguments against like the goodness of God by making arguments that the Bible is promoting ideas that women are property and so forth. So I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts about how were women viewed in the ancient world.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it's something we need to explore because the the reality is that the Bible, what we call the Bible, these 66 books of what we refer to as the Old and the New Testaments, were written in a setting very different from our own. So I like to say the Bible is written to us, or sorry, the Bible is written for us, but it was not written to us. There's a very different audience that the the authors of the Bible have in mind. And there's a very different socio-cultural context that sits behind that. If we're talking about the Old Testament, the ancient Near East, there was a perceived idea that there was a hierarchy. The king was at the top, and there was a status that went down further and further and further. And with a lot of these cultures, when you explore into what's referred to as the ancient Near East, so Mesopotamia, if you read the Old Testament, you read about all the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Canaanites and the mosquito bites, all those ites, right, that you have in the Old Testament. And that's what we refer to as the ancient Near East. And it doesn't matter really where you're looking, the social stratas that you see really start to put women pretty low on that list. And likewise, when you get to the New Testament, what we refer to as the New Testament, those 27 books that talk about Jesus and onward, his immediate followers, they're also in a setting which has women at a very low point in society. In fact, the culture immediately before the time of Jesus, the Greek culture, uh, viewed women in particular um, through the lens of what's referred to as dualism. So there was this idea that human life was viewed as the incarceration of the soul in the material body. So they believed that the spiritual was good and the physical was bad. And so part of that went along with that is that there was an idea, if you read some of these philosophical texts, that women had too much body, which is a funny thing to think about. And in this balance of matter and spirit, this is what Plato says in the 4th century BC. And he actually writes that women are probably sensual reincarnations of immoral men. So there was a very strange but very negative view of women. And then even when you get to Jesus's own day, the 1st century AD, there's a guy named Plutarch, and he has this sort of writing that encompasses a pre-marriage counseling advice in it. And he says, a wife must speak to her husband or through her husband. This is an exact quote. He says, a wife should not acquire her own friends, but should make her husband's friends her own. The gods are first and foremost significant friends. For this reason, it is proper for a wife to recognize only those gods whom her husband worships, shutting the door to superstitious cults and other religions. And so you really start to see the idea that even in the social hierarchies within the Greco-Roman world, women are below men. Women have a view that is under them, and uh, and so there's not a great favorable perception of women, although it is true that certain women who had wealth in the Roman world were afforded more opportunities, who were afforded more rights in that sense, but they still weren't allowed to do things like vote in the system that they had in the Roman world. And so no matter which way you swing it, even the best perceptions of a lot of the women in the ancient world were often they were tainted by the idea that men were above that as a whole. And it's really interesting when you get to Christianity, because first of all, even in the ancient Near Eastern world that I mentioned in the Old Testament, you have this idea that both men and women are created in the image of God. It says male and female, he created them. And so, right, really, on the very first few pages of the very first chapter, the very first book of the Bible, you have a level of agency applied to women that they are also created in the image of God. And that was revolutionary in the ancient world, that women would have been seen on this sort of equal footing and standard as men. And when we zoom ahead and get to Jesus, when we look at the life of Jesus, what we see is that uh, right from the beginning, he radically deferred from the cultural context in regard to this conversation of women. And Jesus was a constant advocate for the agency and equality of women. He talked with women. So in John 4 and Mark 7 and Matthew 9 and Mark 5 and Luke 8, we see all these times where Jesus is discussing various topics with women. He's encouraging towards women in all of the Gospels: Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 7, John 12, and lifting up women of social and economic and even sexual standing, women who were viewed as sort of objects in a sense through prostitution and things like that. He elevates them, and women have uh, they learned at Jesus's feet throughout the Gospels. In fact, in Luke 10, we get an example of that. Luke 10, verse 39, and a concept that would have been seen as radical in the first century, both in Roman and Jewish settings, for a woman to sit at the feet of a rabbi, of a teacher. That was pretty revolutionary. And it's also interesting that we see, taking a glance at the records of early Christianity, one thing that stands out very starkly is that the early Christian movement was almost entirely made up of women. And this is surprising for a number of reasons. One of the first is chiefly being that the population of the Greco-Roman world was predominantly male. So maternal death in childbirth was high. The gender selective infanticidal traditions was common practice when it came to girls. In fact, there was a Roman practice known as exposure, which is essentially an ancient form of abortion, where the woman would give birth, and if it was female, they would leave them uh, near the garbage dumps at the outside of the city. And Christians were famous for saving these babies, for raising them as their own. And all of these sorts of different factors made Roman society disproportionately male. And yet, Christianity was predominantly female in its earliest forms. And I think one of the big reasons for that was that it gave agency to women in particular. The teachings of Jesus and the idea that uh, not only were both male and female created in the image of God, but then women, Christ died for all. He died for the male and the female. And then, as we'll probably talk a little bit more, Paul sort of explicates this in saying that when you come to the table of fellowship, there is no male nor female. Not that those genders don't exist or that they're brushed over, but that we are made one in our equality status through Christ. And this was so obvious that when the Roman magistrate Pliny the Younger wanted to know more about Christianity, it said that he interrogated two female slaves who were known as deaconesses. Um, he's looking for leaders within the early church movement, and he's actually going to particular individuals who are women. There's another ancient writer named Celsus, who's a second century philosopher, and he's a vocal proponent against women, or against Christianity, sorry. And he remarks that, and here's another quote: Christians want and are able to convince only the foolish, dishonorable and stupid. Only the slaves, the women, and the little children. He sort of packs them all into the same category. And this is meant to mock them. It's nobody believes that but the women. And I think we can look at that and we can see, wow, that stands out in that world. But in a world today where we do have far more equality than arguably we've ever had between the sexes, um, we can look at this and see a lot of that trickle down comes from these Judeo-Christian concepts. I mean, let that sink in for a moment. Christianity was mocked for being too pro-women in the ancient world. Literally the objections were they're too full of women. And ancient writers like Lucian and Celsus, they dismissively castigate Christianity as such.
So when you say agency, can
Hmm.
I ask you if you can perhaps define that a little bit for us that might not follow exactly what that means?
Yeah, so agency in terms of equality of opportunity, in terms of seeing both male and female in equal in their status as human beings. So now we definitely put people on different statuses in terms of their economic status, in terms of certain qualifications, and I think that's normal. Uh, in some ways, that's healthy, but we definitely wouldn't say that you know if someone has a greater number of academic degrees than I do, well then they're more of a human being than I am. uh, that doesn't make sense in our modern world, because we understand sort of that humanity is equal to one another in the term is ontologically, like in their being they are equal. We're all in the same boat. We're all part of the human race. But that's not true for the ancient world. If you were a Roman soldier, or sorry, if you were to walk up to a Roman soldier in the ancient world and point to, say, a slave on the road and say, hey, did you know that he has just as much worth as you do? The Roman soldier would look at you and go, no, of course he doesn't. He's way lower than I am in terms of my humanness. Um, and actually, it's interesting, when Christianity was eventually decriminalized by Emperor Constantine in 312 AD, what's referred to as the Edict of Milan, and Christians were given the ability to hold political standing. Along with that, laws were placed on the books for the first time that protected women and children from abuse. And 1 year after that, in AD 313, infanticide was outlawed. And then shortly after that, in 321, financial provision for um, single and poor women uh, and was given. If for no other reason, then there was a practice in the ancient world where if women were, if they were divorced unfairly, or if they became widows, or if they fell into economic collapse, they would often sell their children for subsistence. And these sort of social safety nets were put into place by the government, um, particularly through the Christian means, to prevent this, to outlaw it. And in 428, actually, there was a law against pimps, fathers, and slave owners who were exploiting women for sex. That was condemned and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. And that's the first time in the ancient world that we really start to see those things. And that's what I mean by giving agency. The progression of equality, mind you, was slow in Rome, wasn't built in a day. And but a lot of its social institutions that were pervasive, these things took time to chip away. There's no denying that. But eventually, what we see the Christian worldview starting to permeate the ancient world. You don't get these sorts of laws passed. You don't get this idea that men and women are created equal anywhere in the ancient world. And I would actually advocate also the modern world, aside from the Judeo-Christian worldview. That's where it comes from. you wouldn't naturally get these ideas. Like I said, those hierarchies of the kings and the emperors being on top, and then the social stratus, and then really women, little children, slaves, barbarians, those types of people, they're on the very bottom. That is how the ancient world saw it. And it's when we start to see Christianity permeating throughout the society that we start to see equality. And that's where we start to see that there's no denying that the growth and prevalence of Christianity, and its understanding that all are made in the image of God, right? Like I said, Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. And that, as I mentioned also in Galatians 3:28, Paul says that in Christ there is no male nor female. These types of ideas, they completely revolutionized the ancient world's understanding of equality and particularly value when it came to women.